So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming along. This is the Global North-South in Climate Justice and Activism workshop. And before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that well, all of us in so-called Australia are meeting on Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. I myself are on Wurundjeri Willem country in Preston, so-called Melbourne. And even though it's locked down, I'm very happy to be on this country. I can go walk by the Mary Mary, also known as the Mary Creek, and find time even within my 5 kilometres to connect to country in a local way, which is exciting. So yeah, I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I would invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat and say what country you're on. And also if you could say what activist groups you're part of, that would be really great to help the conversation. But yeah, we're really excited that all of you could join us today to talk about this really important topic and hear from Ruchira. A little bit of background on the workshop is that it's part of the kind of Blockade IMARC, which is the International Mining and Resources Conference. It's part of our counter conference, which is in the lead up to IMARC, which will happen at the end of October at the Melbourne Showgrounds. And I was lucky enough to meet Ruchira last year through Blockade IMARC. We held a counter conference, and Ruchira with some amazing activists from India held a session in that counter conference. And since then we've been chatting, and we thought this conversation was really important to repeat. So I'll chuck the links to Ruchira's session from last year in the chat. And this session, yeah, it's going to go till about 3:30. So we'll hang around if anybody wants to keep chatting. Ruchira will give a presentation and then there'll be some discussion. And so during the discussion, feel free to write any questions in the chat and I'll be monitoring them so they can be saved for the question and answer. And as I said at the start, but in case anybody missed it, this recording is, this session is being recorded. So feel free to message me if you want anything edited out. But yeah, thanks for joining us, and I'll hand over to Ruchira.
Thanks, Anissa, and good to see everyone. Thanks for making it to this session today from everywhere that you are around the world. Yeah, so some of you might have been at the session last year for IMARC that I presented with a couple of Indian activists. And so I'm happy to be back again for an IMARC session. And today's session is going to be divided into 3 parts. But before I get into that, I'm just going to acknowledge that I too live in Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It always will be Aboriginal land. So I have got a few different things for roughly the next kind of 45 minutes, which will also be partly interactive, but also some narration from my part. And then we'll get into the last half an hour at least of discussions. I'm just going to put up some slides right now. Anissa, I think you have to enable slide sharing for me or something like that. It's disabled at the moment.
Yeah, does that work now? Otherwise, I'll make you a co-host.
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to find the... Okay, so can people see my PowerPoint now? I'm just going to maximize it. Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to basically go through 3 sections. One is an overall conceptual framework of what I'm talking about as the North versus South in environmentalism or even climate activism. The second section, which will be interactive, will be a quick discussion on the challenges in negotiating the green groups in Australia, negotiating differences with Indigenous land campaigns and movements. And I think we'll draw on people's experience that we already have in terms of negotiating differences between environmental goals and land justice related goals. And then we'll move with that, based on that, those kinds of relatively understood kind of tools and insights of negotiating difference, we'll move to the last section, which is drawing from my thesis, which I'll talk about in a second, Australia versus India, or the global North versus the South, in terms of negotiating differences of climate justice activism. So basically this session is going to, so I just kind of touched on 3 sections to deal with. So in my thesis, which Anissa, I'm happy if you put a link in the chat box now, in my PhD thesis, which I finished like a few months ago, which is titled Cutting Carbon from the Ground Up, an ethnography of anti-coal activism in Australia and India. I compared a grassroots peasant and Adivasi, with Adivasi are the indigenous people of India. I compared a peasant and Adivasi community's resistance to a coal mine in their forests alongside activists from Greenpeace India with various strands of the movement against Adani, which is the Stop Adani and the Wangan and Jagalingou traditional owners and farmers in Australia. But I critically focused in my thesis on the difference in the aims, visions, and politics of these different kinds of movements which came together for a common purpose, like the 3 strands that came together in Australia to fight the Adani mine, and also Greenpeace Indian activists who worked with grassroots rural communities to fight a coal mine in India. Essentially, the purpose of my thesis was to be able to understand, where common ground lies between these literally different societies which came together to fight as one movement. So the motivation for my thesis was basically through a very long process of observing differences between how issues are framed and how they're relevant for different actors, such as Indigenous people versus middle-class white environmental activists, even middle-class Indian activists such as myself versus rural Indian populations. And also observing a distinct difference and how power operates in these kinds of networks, who is wielding power over who, and suppressing or in a way hegemonizing their issues and the way they need to represent some issues. So the first section, which will kind of briefly introduce some conceptual frameworks. And then in the second section, it'll be interactive. And we're going to draw on, kind of some of your experiences, as I already said. In the last section, again, I'll do a little bit of narration and then we'll get into a discussion. So now, if you look at this slide, and I'll come to the next, I'll kind of change this to the next slide in just a couple of minutes. These include some pointers on how wilderness-centric environmentalism practiced in the United States and similar cultural geographies such as in Australia has been critiqued from the perspectives of human-centric environmental justice of marginalized communities, such as the environment justice movement in North America and the environmentalism of the poor, as it is called, in the global South. This terminology comes from scholar activists in India in particular, but they have used that to describe many other uprisings in collectively what is known as the global South or developing countries. I'm going to speak to some of these contentions that have been raised from the global South about the global North. By deeming places from where Indigenous presence has been removed by the violent process of settler colonialism, and calling them pristine, wilderness-centric environmentalism has not only disregarded, but also been complicit in perpetuating historical injustice. Both the popular and the post-material expressions of wilderness centricity, expressed through the creation and popularization of national parks after World War II, and radical ecology activism, which we have seen, strain of which was also prevalent in Australia. These were underpinned by deep ecology's vision for wilderness as the only authentic essence of nature, since it had predated human occupation. So the wilderness thesis made it evident that who got to define nature and consequently how nature was constructed was essentially about power, who had power. By excluding urban and industrial concerns, environmentalism deflected awareness from everyday places and the reality of the people who live in those everyday places. So even as American environmentalists took on big new challenges in the 1970s based on science, they ended up excluding the concerns of certain people. Such exclusions assumed racial overtones against the backdrop of historic settler colonialism and structural inequalities. The scientific conservation model of the North also carried portentous consequences when applied to the global South, because the creation of national parks forced the displacement of indigenous people, such as in India. The dispossession of Adivasis from their lands for the creation of tiger reserves in India that started in the 1970s is considered a clear example of the effects that a northern conservation framework have in the context of southern geographies. On the basis of this effect, a historian who I refer to a lot with my work, and I'll probably also discuss a few times today, Ramachandra Guha, has argued that the practice of scientific conservation can result in a direct transfer of resources from the poor for the benefit of the rich, causing critical social injustices. Indian ecologists tried to reframe the framework of northern conservation to fit the contexts of the South, and an Indian ecologist named Madhav Gadgil came up with conservation models for Indian forests that worked with the reality of the lived presence of peasants and Adivasis on their land and was critical of the one-size-fits-all Western scientific model. It's going to move to the next slide. So these are some of the critiques of the scientific conservation and environmentalism of the North, as it's called. Scientific ecology's claim to universality has been challenged. In the 1980s, while radical ecocentrism aimed to preserve wilderness through scientific ecology, the emergent environmental justice movement in North America, which represented the struggles of low-income and vulnerable communities of racial minorities, including Native Americans, aimed to stop governments and corporations from turning poor neighborhoods into hazardous waste sites. Being concerned with the direct impacts of social economic inequality, the environment justice movement aimed for a future based on justice, empowerment, and accountability. Some of the metrics that did not exist in the environment movement per se, because of, again, who it represented and who it came from. For affected communities, the environment occurred where they lived, worked, and played, not out there. So if you're interested, you can look up two texts, Varieties of Environmentalism, Essays North and South, by Ramachandra Guha and Juan Martinez Aliar. It's a text that kind of, in a scholarly realm, it changed the concept of what is understood as environmentalism globally by contesting the fact that there was only one kind of politics of environmentalism that the world should follow. Critics question the relevance of radical ecocentrism in addressing underlying causes of environmental degradation as well. Rachel Carson had exposed the chemical industry through Silent Spring, and Limits of Growth had reported, had identified resource depletion and introduced terms such as Earth's carrying capacity to the world. At the same time, environmentalism's response was to develop an ecocentric philosophy. Paradoxically, even though ecocentric environmentalism's narratives, kind of railed against the destruction of the world, its politics turned on an enlightened individualism instead of a collective social action to transform destructive global capitalism. This was one of the consistent underlying critiques from other forms of environmental activism towards Northern environmentalism. So now I'm going to skip over many other political and intellectual contestations between Northern environmentalisms and others, and come to where climate change is creating, to the question of whether climate change is creating a chance to achieve this kind of commonality across the different kinds of environmental activisms and their philosophies and ideologies today. So basically this slide and the next slide, which I'll turn to in a minute. Issues of equity and historical responsibility on the issue of climate change has added new dimensions to the North-South divide in environmentalism. One of the most critical concerns from the South has been that the North's lack of consideration for social equity and historic injustice in attributing responsibility for carbon emissions. Many scholars and networks from the South have exposed the politics of blame and agenda setting surrounding the global warming problem and the promotion of first world control environmental management mechanisms in the global South. Critics of Northern environmentalism think Critics of Northern environmentalism think that a possibility for common ground was particularly enhanced owing to Northern environmentalisms having come face to face with social impacts of industrialism that are now being writ large on the account of global warming everywhere. There are no pristine places anymore, technically. Climate change is changing everything. And the intertwining of human and environmental fates due to climate change has generated an opportunity for wilderness-centric environmentalism to go beyond its past legacy. For communities that have historically survived environmental injustices, climate change implies yet another set of anthropomorphic ecological disruptions, ecological disruptions that they have had no role in creating, but for which they bear the worst brunt. Climate change has therefore compounded the significance of their historic resistance and compelled them to go beyond their local outlook. So while continuing to aim for justice, empowerment, and accountability, the environment justice movement in the US has now gone truly global through the climate justice movement. Environmental justice and climate justice have been articulated in new social upsurges such as Black Lives Matter, which has pointed to the disproportionate concentration of incinerators and waste facilities in poor non-white neighborhoods and called for divesting from fossil fuels. For Indigenous people, the present risk of climate change evokes past injustices of colonial dispossession and cultural disruption. And climate justice has become an umbrella issue under which they can articulate many environmental injustices. Indigenous climate justice is also intricately linked to notions of sovereignty. Movements for Indigenous environment justice have therefore remained centered around land rights. We clearly see this in Australia. The economic, social, and cultural displacement of vulnerable communities would continue to worsen under climate change, exacerbating what Nixon had called the slow violence of the poor. The interpretation of a climate problem by Southern civil society groups have remained grounded in a fundamental principle of equity and justice. But in India, the interesting issue is that climate change has remained in the domain of few elite policy and science-based NGOs primarily, and foreign policy experts. The activism of grassroots science and climate justice groups and transnational organizations such as Greenpeace, where I've myself worked at one point of time, have been instrumental in turning the spotlight of climate responsibility inwards towards India's highly unequal society and the disproportionate burden that the poor will face because of climate change. But they have also called for intragenerational equity for the poor. Such activisms have criticized the government's developmental frame, which, while seeking equity on the global stage as a southern nation, has continued to play on the domestic division between the urban rich and the poor and hidden its emissions behind the poor. But what is also interesting is that in the context like India, the Indian civil society, urban, middle class activist networks, the kind of network I come from myself, does not use climate change as an overarching frame for a range of different kinds of environmental justice issues. Like, for example, we've started doing in Australia, everything is related to climate change now. With regards to the environmentalism of the poor, peasant, Adivasi, grassroots, rural networks fighting for environmental justice in India, the mass environmental movements who constitute 65% of the India's population. That's the kind of size of the population from where these movements arise, which is the majority of India's environmental activism. Climate change has not generated mass mobilizations, but energy projects such as coal mining and thermal power generation continue to, like before, generate discontent amongst them because of loss of land and livelihoods. This poses a stark difference between grassroots movements, even in Australia for that matter, and hence poses a critical difference between what's going on in the North versus South with climate justice mobilization. So this is broadly some of the very ballpark differences between the North versus South, how I categorize it. I just want to take any questions of clarification if people have at this point before we get into the next session, which will be a bit of a discussion as well. I'll just stop sharing for a second. Yeah, happy to take any questions or just kind of any questions of clarification or any thoughts or something before we get into the next one.
Hello, I'm just wondering if it would be possible to access a recording of this, because I don't know if it will...
Could we have a question? Yeah, I'm just trying to there was so much there, and really appreciate it. It sounds like there's a lot to go and read, and that's exciting. Just wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about what it is of the climate justice narrative that isn't mobilizing people in India, or is there something particular about the climate justice narrative that isn't that leaves it remaining in like elitist circles or foreign policy expert circles? Maybe just some clarification around that. Yeah.
I'll actually be getting more into, thanks Nick and Dan, I'll actually kind of get into that more in the last segment, which is India versus Australia directly. But it's just kind of, I'm just going to put this just as, again, as a conceptual thing. When I look at the mass movements on the environment in India, which is again not coming from the middle class, which is what I am, but it's coming from peasant and Adivasi populations, which is 65% of the Indian population, yeah, is rural and living on land or off land, and the fights are related to being dispossessed from land and livelihoods. There is a comparison that can be drawn between them and, say, the environment justice movement that I talked about, and even indigenous movements in the global north. But this is there's been very less written or discussed on this. But when I try to conceptualize this and write about it, I'm saying that it's this like the environment justice movement, indigenous movements in Australia, they're kind of also mingling in the same social spaces with the wide environmental movement, which has made climate change such a big thing. And by that kind of proximity, climate change also then becomes something that they talk about, but they talk about it in entirely their own different way, which is about bringing historic justices to the forefront. India is a curious case also because the politics of being a southern country, kind of recently independent and asserting itself on the world stage and needing to grow, that argument is very strongly seated in different levels of civil society. So while people like myself will talk about the need for India to decarbonize, we'll also say, look at Australia and look at the US. So that puts Indian environmental activists in this kind of strange space of punching upwards and punching downwards, or But the interesting thing with environmental activism from the ground up in India is that you just have kind of a mass of humanity just struggling to be on land and not be dispossessed. And the narrative of climate change is something that exists out there. Like climate change might impact them tomorrow, but being dispossessed from the land is affecting them today. So it just becomes this practical kind of reality of what they're surviving. And linkages are being made with climate change, but that's kind of exists in the outer realm of the reality of, the kind of the space of conflict that they're in every day. So yeah, that's kind of where it is. If there's any other question, otherwise we'll get into the next session. Okay. I'll just bring the slide up really quickly and maybe take it down again. Yeah, you can see the slides? Yeah, okay. So basically what I wanted to do was actually get some responses from you. We've kind of got 20 minutes for this section. I wanted to get, the aim of this session is to be able to come out with some conceptual tools, but also some ways in which we can understand how to negotiate differences between, say, for example, Australian and Indian environmental movements, given their vast differences. And I thought one of the good ways of doing it is to actually walk through somewhere where we have some understanding of how to negotiate differences, or where we actually failed, understanding of where we actually failed to negotiate differences, which is in Australia, people in the environment movement have some understanding of the vast differences that exist between the historic land justice and sovereignty aims of Indigenous movements versus the environmental aims of an environmental campaign and an environmental movement. So I wanted to actually draw on some of those and get responses from you, and that'll help us go to the next section in a more kind of informed manner. So basically think of any of these areas which have been held activist scholars write about these areas as the points which create the most tension in terms of creating alliances between environmental campaigns and Indigenous movements, which is a fundamental mismatch between the aims of conservation and land-based prosperity, about how Western science devalues Indigenous knowledge, and the fact that green-black relations cannot last because of fundamental differences in aims. They can only be tactical at best. And the last one, which I'll also throw into the mix instead of separating the two conversations, is, do you think climate change is actually creating more common ground than before between the vision and mission of the environment movement and Indigenous land struggles? So, I'm happy to either, maybe I'll just take the slides down so we can have a better conversation. So these are these 4 things. If you want to make just a little mental note: fundamental mismatch, how Western science devalues Indigenous knowledge, and possible workarounds that have happened between, on this in alliances before. Green-black relations can be tactical at best, or examples where they have been longer than just tactical relations. And a reflection on whether climate change is creating any kind of common ground between the vision and mission of environmental campaigns and Indigenous land struggles that could not happen before, before climate change was an issue. So I'm going to take the slides down now, and maybe I'm going to ask Anisa, our wonderful host Anisa, for some reflections actually from her own experience to kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Ruchir. And I was wondering, are you able to copy and paste those 4 questions and put them in the chat? I tried to type them out, but I wasn't fast enough.
I'll do that.
Thanks heaps. And yeah, I'll get us started. I think for me, especially when thinking about green-black relations in the kind of Australian environmental movement, has been a really interesting journey for me over the 7 or so years I've been doing this. And I've gone through lots of stages of complete ignorance, and then you learn something, and then I got really, really angry and felt really guilty, and got quite judgmental, and got caught up in this urgency feeling. And I think for me, where I've come to is something that's been really useful, has been able to kind of understand that this stuff is really urgent, but kind of sit back and practice sitting in the uncomfortability of it, so that I can actually learn and listen. Because I grew up in the inner city of Melbourne. I'm from the middle class, and so I think it's just been really good to take that time to reflect on myself, and then reflect on what my kind of middle class culture and interests, how that shaped the environmental movement in Australia, kind of understanding that, reading the history and understanding that a lot of it, the Franklin and the start of the Greens Party in Tasmania was very much kind of middle class people who wanted to protect the nice places where we like to go walking in our holidays, which is very much what I grew up understanding nature as this thing that was far away. And so sitting back and learning from people who have a very different experience, and not trying to solve that straight away or jump to a conclusion or go and, it's kind of been about forming genuine relationships so that I can work out how to support, not from my own point of view. And being part of different environmental kind of campaigns and organizations in Australia has been really interesting to watch. Unfortunately, there's a lot of tokenism that happens. I think, at least, people are saying to understand that this is important, but we can get into the habit of focusing on our own campaigns and then adding a little extra, oh, and this, oh, and the Global South, oh, and the, you know, Indigenous sovereignty movements. And so I think in the last workshop I was in with Ruchira last time, there was a really great comment you made that was kind of like, if we're going to do this non-tokenistically, this might mean changing our strategy, you know, rather than saying we're going to stop coal and let's add in a story about India. It's like, no, let's listen to the, you know, struggles on the ground and then work out how that brings in, how that changes our strategy. And for me, that brings in questions of neoliberalism, of capitalism, of power, and it goes quite deep. But those are some of my thoughts. I think we'd love it if other people wanted to jump in. Maybe just unmute yourself or write in the chat.
No, I'm happy for people to just kind of speak up. And, you know, in the chat, I'm just putting some things that are coming out of your comments. Like Anissa, I've taken tokenism and, you know, basically not trying to solve the problem straight away. Some of the things that you kind of clearly came out in the examples you gave. So yeah, people, please just kind of unmute yourself and talk.
I think for me, sometimes as well, there's a fair bit of NIMBYism in our climate movement. So, you know, in some cases, like with people like Alan Jones coming on board with the, which was it the gas one, the gas campaign? And like literally only jumping on board because it affected his property, and it was, you know, that there was potential exploration going to be happening around his property. So for me, I have a lot of problems around that as well, because it kind of, it's not necessarily looking at the whole picture. It's just literally looking at your own backyard.
Maybe, can you hear me? Maybe I can come in here a little bit with my experience in Indonesia. So I went there about 20 years ago to encourage a waste management program. And over 20 years I've observed what happened. And the lessons were that the village I worked in was a village in Yogyakarta, and it adopted waste separation and recycling practices for the first 3 or 4 years when money was flowing in. The poorest often said, because they used to burn their waste, and they also dumped it in the backyards and buried it. And so there was a lot of pollution. But basically, I would say the poorest often felt, this is not my priority. I need food. I need to educate my kids. I need to build my house. And I need shelter. And so it wasn't number one priority. So this program, I realized that imposing what we were doing in Australia and what was going on in the West, in Europe, which recycling and separation seemed like an imposition coming with our ideas. And I guess that's the green Westerner coming with ideas about health and air pollution and so on. But what happened in the end, that village became a model for other villages that adapted the program to their own needs. And it was largely women who succeeded in, our program was based around men. We went in through men. So I began to see how a program eventually integrated into local communities, but it was really decentralized, and women had to go house to house, and it had to be their priority, basically. But so it's interesting, after 20 years, I'm still linked into the communities that have succeeded, and it was really women running the show at that local level. But admittedly, the main ones were civil servants, middle-class people who could have the space to do this sort of work. And they did cottage industries out of recycled waste and things like that. I just thought that might be an interesting thing of how a Westerner comes in with green ideas and how they get changed, and progressively you have to wait a long evolve and adapt to a local community setting. And now under COVID, God knows what has happened. I was actually going to be ringing Indonesia now during this session to see how they're going. Anyway, that's my little bit.
Can you hear me? Maybe I can go next if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I guess for me, what Anita said at the start really resonated with me. So starting with the ignorance and then not really knowing what to do or how to do things. So sort of being aware and uncomfortable, but not knowing how to go about it. And I think I'm still very much in this space, and as well as ignorance, like a mix of that. And I think we are often in the climate movements in a position of saying, how can we welcome Indigenous people, or how can we welcome, more lower socioeconomic people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or these sorts of things. But still in this headspace of how can we attract them instead of how can we change to move towards them. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
I'll just quickly add something on what Coralie just said. Like, I've seen that very strongly, especially in Extinction Rebellion and other groups, of how do we get them to join us? And then slowly people having a headspace change of like, oh, wait, maybe our strategy and what we're doing doesn't work for them. So how do we go and support what they're already doing? Has been a really interesting change.
Can people reflect a little on what might have, and I know this might be too context specific for those of you joining from outside Australia, but kind of just in the kind of for the benefit of taking one thread to then tie up with another. So when I asked, do people have examples of where it has worked between the environment movement in Australia and Indigenous land struggles? And if so, what has been the shift or the change in the way environmental groups have done things? And also specifically the reflection on is the issue of climate change and, the requirements it has, is that changing and creating more common ground, or is that, yeah, I just want some reflections on that.
Can I maybe just offer my thoughts on that, Ruchira? I'm a member of the Greens, and the Greens, within the Greens, there's a Black Greens network or a First Nations network, and the Greens have kind of adopted or agreed that the First Nations network should be a recognised part within the political party. And I see that the Greens are working with Indigenous Australians or Aboriginal Australians as part of the Greens movement effectively. And I think, to your question, is climate change creating common ground that did not exist before? I think it is, and part of that is recognition by white and mainstream Australians that Indigenous Australians actually know how or knew how to manage the environment in a sustainable way, because Aboriginal people lived here for 60,000 years before European settlement and managed the environment effectively and sustainably. And I think more and more mainstream Australians have to recognise that and look to Aboriginal understanding of how to manage and be stewards of the environment.
Any other reflections in that space of, either with climate change itself, what it's making the environment movement acknowledge? David touched on that, or examples where, some of you have put examples in chat, and the nuclear movement, of course, is a people say it's not even, can't call it the environment movement. It was part of the peace movement and so on and so forth. Any other examples that come to mind where things have worked out, and what has been the radical shift in the practice and thinking of the environment movement? Are you speaking, Dan? You're on mute if you are, so. No, they're talking amongst themselves. So, I mean, just happy for you to kind of stew on this for a bit. I'm not going to try to draw this thing to a close. It's more about kind of having some thoughts trigger in you, which you can actually take to the next slot, which will be 15 minutes. Because some of the understandings that are already there in terms of both how climate change might be creating this kind of a space where environment movements need to acknowledge the value and the knowledge systems of indigenous societies, and so on and so forth. Some of that also applies to when you're looking at resistances and people's movements in the global south. What is interesting is that, and this is my observation of having kind of been involved with environmental movements here in Australia, and coming from India and having come from an environmental movement space, there is that it's not something that's easily understood, acknowledged, that there might be similar but different understandings about grassroots environmental activism from the global south or the developing countries and their indigenous populations and peasant populations that we need to learn. So I find kind of, it's an interesting social observation for me. But I'm going to now try and ask you to think of some of these points that have been raised in this session, while I read out maybe just a little section and a narration of people's mass environmental movements in India. And then we'll come to a bigger discussion on how to reconcile the differences. So what I'm going to read out to you as quickly as I can is more like a personalized story, and I found that that's a better way to try and understand some of what's going on the ground in India than trying to give you a serious PowerPoint, because I might be a better conduit for you into the many layers of Indian society and what's going on there politically, rather than just trying to tell you a story directly from the ground there, which you might not have experienced. Some of you have. I know David's been in India for a while and worked with grassroots communities, but most people haven't. So basically, I'm going to bring the slides back on. Sorry. Can you see my screen? Thanks. So I'm going to read out to you a story I read out in a couple of Stop Adani roadshows that happened recently. And I'm going to touch on all of these different things on the context, politics, and narratives of environmentalism in India, and the scales and consequences of, so India went through a resource boom, similar to the Australian resource boom. For those of you dialing in from outside Australia, the last, from mid-90s till till 2015, Australia went through a massive resource boom, and that pretty much changed the landscape in a way, changed the power scales, and basically kind of galvanized the environment and climate movements to one kind of big fight against coal, gas, and fossil fuels collectively. India also went through a minerals boom around the same time. And I just want to talk to you about how critically different they were in terms of social impacts, because they're entirely different societies. And I'm going to talk about some kind of compare and contrast the climate movement here with parallel movements in India, which had nothing to do with the climate, but were fighting environmental fights. And of course, touch on critical differences between indigenous movements themselves between India and Australia. And then finally come to that point, which I keep thinking about constantly, about why coal versus renewables, which is the frame of kind of environmental activism from here in Australia and a global frame is just not enough for a future based on justice and kind of security of livelihoods for people living on the land in India. Why we need to have a more broader and more just frame. So these are some of the, I'm just gonna, yeah. If you look at the, these are the pointers, and these are, if you look at the questions on slide 7, sorry. Just a second. So I'm going to just start telling you a little story about where I come from in India and how that place has entirely changed because of the kind of resource drive India has gone through over the last 20, 30 years. I come from the eastern Indian state of West Bengal, and I grew up in Kolkata, the capital, which used to be the capital of colonial India. And an industrial township, I grew up between Kolkata and an industrial township, 3 hours train ride northwest from Kolkata. The steel plant that my father was an engineer in, of course, relied on Australia's high quality coking coal. And I'm talking about the 80s here, when I was growing up, 80s and 90s. My father, who's long retired, still talks about how fine that coal from Newcastle was. That low-lying tidal region of the state of West Bengal that I come from, very close to the Bay of Bengal, is very climate imperiled, same as Bangladesh from South Asia. But that risk of climate change emerged much later and then sat on top of many other multi-layered risks and injustices towards people, especially Adivasi indigenous people. Where I come from sits along the eastern rim of coal and mineral deposits below the ground and forests above the ground in the central Indian region. Central India's sal tree forests, SAL, sal tree forests have been home to various Adivasi groups with distinct cultures and languages for centuries. They have also been sites of struggle since the colonial era, when the British denied them access to their forests, took over the forests for logging to fuel the Industrial Revolution in England and its colonial spread in India through the building of the Indian Railway. Mining occurred during the colonial period as well, but it occurred more significantly since India's independence in 1947, and the saga of Adivasi struggles continued into the next era and took on newer dimensions. The next part of this story is on the contradiction of India's post-independence development. And I think the climate question that you asked earlier, Dan, relates to this. So I'm going to elaborate on this through, kind of while I finish this bit of the narration. And the definition of environmental justice for subsistence-based groups in India in the post-colonial society is much more complex than it is for, kind of indigenous populations in Australia. So if we look at basically this slide, the post-colonial southern context of environmental justice, which is what defines the story of environmental injustice to India's indigenous people, starts with this. The constitution, India's constitution, which is one of the world's most progressive, attempted to address massive inequality in a society along the lines of caste, race, gender, wealth and education, and so on and so forth. It addressed the historic marginalization of Adivasis from their land by giving them special protections in the constitution. But India's post-colonial development asserted India's sovereignty on the world stage, and it justified a continuation of colonial dispossession of Adivasis and peasants for industrially developing a new nation. So this is not exactly the continuation of colonization in a settler colonial society. It is the continuation of colonization of certain people, indigenous people in a post-colonial society. It really complicates the kind of context and gives them lesser legitimacy in a way to oppose those kinds of developments, socially speaking. Contradictorily, India justified the colonial dispossession of Adivasis for industrially developing a new nation. Around 2/3 of Indians still live in non-urban settings, as I was talking about before. the capitalist industrial model of development disproportionately affected such rural populations that lived outside the folds of capitalism, while people like myself clearly benefited from, being in a kind of newly independent country. The majority of India's environmental movements in the 70s and 80s and early 90s were mass environmental movements of peasants and Adivasis who risked losing their lands, lives, and lands and livelihoods and forests to a development that they did not share in and did not get any benefits from. This made these movements distinctly different from what scholars call northern environmentalisms. So here we have the Franklin Blockade from the 1980s, and we have the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which has been called the world's longest running environmental movement from India, which ran at around the same time, and the stark difference between who was again fighting for what. So I'm going to go through a few slides and show you pictures. This is, so if we look through these slides, comparing Australia and India, a simple way to compare the Chipko Andolan, which is here on the top here. Chipko means to hug in Hindi, and the women were hugging the trees to stop them from being felled. A simple way to compare Chipko with the forest blockades in Australia that occurred around the same time in the 80s is to think about who is fighting for what. The social and economic divide and the difference between the asks of the women of Chipko in the foothills of the Indian Himalayas where the movement occurred, for their forests not to be felled so they could continue with their livelihoods. It differs from the movements to leave forests untouched. Chipko was able to force the authorities towards community-based forest management. Movements in India and their idea of environmental justice comes closest to indigenous resistances in the settler colonial north, but they differ in two very important ways. The risk of removal from lands on which they actually live and which is their only means of subsistence is still an ongoing reality for India's Adivasis and peasants. Also, all of this occurs within the framework of post-colonialism, which makes the idea of injustice and justice more complicated. I touched on this slightly earlier. So I'm just, sorry, before I go into this, I'll just talk about, so recently FLAC and people at the camp in Binbee did blockades up in the central Queensland. And I was heartened to hear that a few weeks ago, a protester locked onto Adani's machinery there in central Queensland and demanded justice for the Wangan and Jagalingu and for an Indian Adivasi activist, Hidme Markham. Hidme Markham is a 28-year-old Adivasi woman from central India and a human rights activist. Markham led a platform that witnessed state and corporate violence against Adivasis and worked for the release of Adivasi prisoners. She was arrested in March this year. A key link here is that Markham's community empowerment work against mining without consent obviously upset the powers that be and Adani. Hidme had mobilized against Adani's mining practices in central India. So this is another dimension to the structural difference between Adivasi and peasant mobilizations and activist leaders in India, the South versus Australia, the North. While the Wangan and Jagalingu, even though their campaign was unsuccessful, was able to take their story to the world stage, someone like Hidme Markham does not directly have access to global platforms. While I compare Australia and India, I think about how Adivasi movements and leaders can similarly and directly find a global voice and empowerment through solidarity. Adivasi leaders from India, that is. So just going to this. So basically, those of you who have been in the environment movement longer than a decade, particularly those who have been in it intergenerationally, you might more or less agree with my nutshell analysis on how the minerals boom has changed Australian environmentalism, that the scale of changes was so massive that new relations and alliances, such as between environmentalists and farmers, started forming, and that the scale of coal extraction, and of course also gas extraction, increased so much that at the same time that the world was heading towards a climate agreement, that Basically, the environment and climate movements came together at the national, regional, and grassroots level to create one big front to try and stop coal and fossil fuels. So India had a parallel time frame to Australia's minerals boom, but to the I won't have time to delve into the details of that, but I can broadly say that, thinking about the North versus South framework, India's mobilizations did not give rise to a mass climate movement. The scale of environmental conflicts increased during this time in India, and people's movements and environmentalisms of the poor kept articulating issues as before of being driven and dispossessed from lands. In slides 13, this one, 14 and 15, I'll just keep going back. I present these differences through my thesis case studies, and these I've just put some images up on the slides here. The Indian community on slide 15, this one, fought to keep their forests for their land and livelihoods, much like Chipko that I mentioned. When Greenpeace activists in India worked with this local movement on the ground, in the villages and at the local level, they too spoke of forest and land rights, not about climate. While internationally, when they held up the story from this place, that is Mahan in central India, they talked about climate change. So basically, I won't have time to get into the details of my case study, but it's going to come to the last two sets and we'll kind of open up to a discussion. So I've been thinking about the frame of coal, stop coal and yes to renewables, which is very strongly kind of the platform of climate activism today from Australia and also globally. And I've been thinking about what it doesn't include in terms of justice for communities such as my case study in India and some of the other examples I already talked about before. So when we say no coal and yes to renewables from the, from environmental and climate movements here in Australia, we don't necessarily talk about the need for energy democracy. For small scale energy projects, which is what communities such as on this slide here, this community fighting for their forests in central India, who don't have electricity and are going to be displaced for producing more electricity from coal. The kinds of solutions that they need are basically small scale decentralized energy that they can access. Energy democracy, so they have a say in projects that don't displace them or take their livelihoods away. And also questions of sustainability and security for their futures. What if we were to invert the frame and think about a global narrative that could hold decentralized energy democracy, livelihoods, security, and sustainability for such communities that fall outside the folds of capitalism still, at the center of a global climate justice conversation, which says, yes, we need to phase out coal, and yes, we need to have renewables, but these are some of the fundamental concerns of some of the most vulnerable communities that we need to take care of while we have that transformation. And what might be some of the tools, the conceptual tools, the emotional tools, the educational tools that global environmental activists and networks need to have to be able to, in order to be able to do this or create this kind of a narrative. Education, of course, reflexivity, platform building that can bring them to the fore, and also right representation of the kinds of issues that these people on the ground are dealing with. So this was, I know that this was a very rushed presentation. I try to pack a lot in, but I'm happy to kind of give people clarifications as and when needed if I had rushed over things and it wasn't clear. But what I really want to do right now is just first get some quick reflections, but then open up to a discussion of, open up to reflections on how you might be able to take some of these understandings and incorporate them into what you do. I think that might be a useful conversation to end it with. So first, just a quick set of reflections on the presentation so far.
Nick or Dan, do you want to say? Oh yeah, John, sorry, you go. And then maybe Nick or Dan, you can say that.
Yep, this is a quick one, a pretty unsophisticated kind of comment, but it was a big learning for me. I spent 5 years living on the west side of Cape York with Aboriginal families as a family therapist, believe it or not, training Aboriginal family therapists. And I think one of the revelations for, you know, privileged white boys particularly is that there's not a single view about anything within an Indigenous family or an Indigenous village. So I think as a starting point, listening is just so important because you can't make an assumption that an Indigenous group in Australia or anywhere is necessarily going to be anti-mining or pro-coal or anti-coal. These are really racial stereotypes that often white people go into, often that are welfare-oriented white people go into Indigenous communities, making all kinds of assumptions that, you know, there'll be a set of uncontested views about, you know, within a village or within family groups about how things should be done. You know, there's really hot, you know, on Cape York, the west side of Cape York, there's highly contested views within the Indigenous population about the development of bauxite, whether they're willing to move their whole community to get the benefit of royalties from bauxite. There's very contested views about global warming as well, ranging from, yeah, we acknowledge it and we'd like to be part of doing something about it, to, well, no, guys like you, John, caused this shit to happen. You've been the beneficiaries of it. We got bigger fish to fry in terms of economic development. You get on with doing your climate work, but we're trying to get ourselves out of the shithole that's been created for us, you know, through historical oppression. So just kind of making a plea for, you know, not falling for traditional, often somewhat left-oriented racial stereotypes about, you know, groups that you might want to work with, necessarily having, you know, consistent, uncontested opinions or positions about things that are very important. And once you realise this, it shouldn't come as any revelation, really. You could take any family anywhere in the world or any village anywhere in the world, and you'll find highly contested views about things. So it really is a racial stereotype. It's an example of what I would call soft racism that people like us need to be careful about. So that's, as I said, an unsophisticated kind of comment. Thanks, Anissa.
Any other? So you're happy? No, I'm happy if you want to respond to any of the things that have been raised so far as well, or just kind of, yeah, specifically something you drew out of the this last bit, and yeah.
Hi up, Campbell.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for all the everything that's been shared thus far. I suppose back to an earlier part of the conversation, I really felt that this year's NAIDOC theme, Heal Country, Heal Our Nation, was a really generous and challenging and you know, inspirational First Nations peoples led initiative, if you like, to and really put it back out there to all of us to consider the breadth and scope of everything that we're talking about today, and I mean, I suppose a challenge to all of us, as, you know, as we head out of this and back into often, you know, spaces where there is ongoing work required to decolonize ourselves and our peers and our groups and our organisations and so on, is yeah, you know, what are the next steps to move that forward in those in the various groups that we are active in, I suppose.
I'll offer a few thoughts. Like, I really like Ruchira, the inversion of the narrative, and I think that's been something that's been really hard and I found really difficult to address in Australian environmentalism, which is kind of, I think people fall into the slogan-based politicking where we need to have a simple no to coal, yes to renewables. And often, when people like me, living in inner city Melbourne, that just sounds nice. Out there, stop digging up coal, and then out there build a whole bunch of huge renewable things. But that we've got to kind of slow down, deepen our politics and deepen our narrative to understand what would that large scale renewable solution look like for different people, and hear those stories on the ground. And that's why I'm really excited in the Blockade IMARC space of being able to talk about extractivism and talk about, mining of any minerals. How does that look? And what does that mean? Because Australia, where we have huge amounts of mining companies overseas doing this sort of thing. And so I really like one way for me to take this past tokenism is for us to really look into our strategies and take responsibility. If our campaigns are saying 100% renewable energy, what are the potential side effects of that, and who are we potentially throwing under the bus when we're not kind of stepping up and making a more complicated, more nuanced narrative? And I think, David, you want to speak, and then we'll go to Nato?
Thanks, Anissa. I really got a question for Ruchira. Ruchira, I'm just interested, can you tell us a bit more about how the environment movements in India are coping now with the very repressive Modi government? And also, like you've talked about the Chipko movement a bit, but I'm wondering about the anti-dam movement, which I understand has been, a very big movement in India in the past. Is that continuing, or what's happened with that?
Thanks, David. Before I go on to your question, I'd see Apsara asked me if I can say a little bit more about why we as climate activists in the West should be moving away from a one-size-fits-all model of transitioning to clean energy. So, I didn't have too much time to touch on it, but I've given here a link, which one of my colleagues, one of my mentors actually back in the Indian environment movement, wrote about, basically making the case against large-scale renewables. And I think it's a good read. So kind of just a few ballpark things there. One is that renewables are starting to create the fourth wave of displacement of Adivasi and peasant people from their lands. What dams did, what coal government, public kind of thermal project, coal power projects, and then private coal power projects did. Now renewables are starting to do that. In India, in a populous country with a larger land-based rural population than an urban population, large-scale projects, the scale of projects is critical. Like, I haven't seen any organized vocalization of discontent from Indigenous communities in Australia to large-scale renewable projects. Like outside Broome, there's a massive solar park, and that has Indigenous ownership, and the community is very proud about it. So scale is obviously something that is not becoming a massive point of discontent and grievances for Indigenous communities in the North, but they are in the South. So this is very geography contextual, and it has to be taken into account. The second thing is large-scale energy projects, be they renewable or be they fossil fuel, which is coal in India's case primarily, fit into the central grid. And the communities that I briefly showed you, that photograph of the women kind of hugging trees, which is the case study I studied in central India, in Mahan, they still live without electricity, and they would be displaced for another thermal power plant and coal mine from their lands. they would also be displaced for large-scale solar projects, which would feed into the grid. So we know about grid and energy injustice. We know about large-scale and energy injustice conceptually. They play out all the time in India, which is why scale is so important. And one first thing that all Indian campaigners, environmental campaigners, be they middle class or not, talk about is the solution for India is decentralized energy sources. It's something Australian campaigners haven't picked up yet because of their very different contexts. On the question of dams, the thing is, like, dams were the first big energy projects in post-colonial India that started displacing people massively, and mostly Adivasi people. And then came coal, many decades of coal displacements and Dams are coming back, unfortunately, in a big way in India, because that is seen as a clean solution. And it is unnuanced narratives of environmental activists from the global north who have a lot of power and platform, which drive deeper these unjust solutions in the global south. Because dams, hydroelectricity is seen as clean energy, when we don't. So in India, there's a categorization where large hydro is not seen as clean because of how mass movements have made it clear that it cannot be clean when it has so much social injustice behind it. But internationally, that narrative is not seeded. So my colleagues, environmental campaigners in Australia, constantly talk about hydro regardless of scale. And this is the kind of problem it causes in the south. So dams are making a comeback in India. Governments are putting money behind it. And now that India is not a socialist country anymore, there's massive, massive, massive private capital investment. Dams are coming back in. And the Indian government, which is a very repressive government, and is constantly diluting environmental laws and cracking down ruthlessly on environmental movements, more so on grassroots people who have no power and voice. Are going to bring in those kinds of solutions because they get a thumbs up from the West or from the North, which is where being able to incorporate the critical justice needs of communities such as the ones I talked about at the center of a global climate justice narrative is really important. So I think for the sake of time as well, and I'm more than happy to stay on and have chats after 3:30. But I think just for the sake of time, I'll just kind of bring in the other part of the discussion agenda as well, in terms of, kind of, if you speak, also think of how you might take some of this away to incorporate it into the work you do in the network that you are in. What might be the next steps, as one of you said, the next steps. And I think Anisa has some pointers there as well, which feel free to chuck in at any time, Anisa, regarding, FLAC and you and taking some of these things in.
Marisol, did you want to go?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, but it's related to what everyone was saying before. That, it's for Indigenous people like me and many others, since if I talk about the history, as Indigenous Mapuche from South America, from Chile, since the first arrivals, of colonizers, we have been bombarded with falsehoods, that have been unfortunately perpetuated, about my people. And I think about all Indigenous peoples around the world, and that these falsehoods, haven't changed, for centuries about we were demons, and the way until today, the Western and non-Indigenous people patronize us. And we can see that everywhere, in the mainstream media, the information, how they amplify, if anything happening in Indigenous communities, they amplify the issue as a way to make sure governments, we will repress us more and more. And And also, you know, you see until today, you know, that environmentalist groups, you know everyone, of course, you know, they still believe that we cannot survive without having environmentalist group come in and help us and save us from the way, you know, we live. And I think it's important. You see, we are fighting against multinational corporations. We are fighting against forestry company, against dams, you know, hydroelectric companies, mining companies, you know, and it's exhausting. You know, I see my people. I'm very comfortable because I live in Australia for a few years, but I'm every day in contact with my people, and I see, you know, how difficult it is to dream to continue living in our land, to defend our land every day, you know. And yeah, governments talking about, you know, environmentalist solutions, but again, those environmentalist solutions also will affect our land, you know. So it's, as you said, they think that dams are more environmentally friendly. Yeah, really? Most of the indigenous cemeteries for my people, they're underwater because of the dams. You know, they have been built to provide electricity to all the rest of the Chilean people. So for me, it's a serious issue. You know, this information that comes from the moment that in our case, you know, the Portuguese and the Spanish people came to our land. They wrote books about art. I'm an anthropologist as a degree, and you know, and the lies that they put in the first book about our people eating, you know, other people, and, you know, creating that false information so people to justify the genocide, you know, they committed and they are still committing, you know, against our people. So I think it's, yeah, climate change is a real thing. We need to do something about it, definitely. But I like what I forgot the name of the person who sent a message before when she said that local indigenous here, you know, they said, yeah, you want to support us, I think it was Siovans, you know, she sent a message saying, you know, but not in front of us, you know, you want to help us, be behind us, you know. So I think that's something very important. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks heaps, Marisol. Should we go to Nato? Ruggieras, a hand up?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Marisol. There's, you know, obviously, you know, it's such a it's just that we kind of break everything up into different kinds of goals and aims that we need to achieve, but it is really about centering a composite kind of vision that Indigenous communities would have for their future in the middle of, you know, kind of right in the center of a global climate justice kind of narrative or claim is what is required, but it's not happening. I put a link in the chat with the people's demand for climate justice, which is, well, it's, I mean, it kind of, these kinds of things have come out of grassroots collaborations around the world of Indigenous and like non-Indigenous grassroots communities. And they kind of, this is a direct kind of polar opposite of corporatized solutions really for climate change and networks that are behind that. So it's possibly worth looking at that in terms of the range of different concerns it raises about what market-driven climate solutions are doing to Indigenous communities on top of the historical continuation of historical forms of colonization, culturally, socially, politically. And it's worth considering how groups in Australia might consider moving towards something like that of a platform from just coal versus renewables. So just wanted to chuck it in there and for you to ponder on, and yeah, maybe just take away as a link to look at in the future. So yeah, and Isa, do you want to ask the next speaker or kind of throw in some points about taking this away?
Well, Nat's got a hand up, so whatever order you want to do it, if you want to talk, or then Nat.
No, let Nat, yeah, Nat definitely go.
Hello, everybody. Thanks. This has been great. So thanks you for everyone's time. I just really wanted to ask like a general question to everybody here. And if I say things like I and we in my question, I'm referring to maybe like the white, globally upper middle class people, whether you're middle class or working class in Australia or however we define it. But definitely like, yeah, anyway. I'm just thinking like the notion of like radical solidarity, I'm assuming from what I've heard from other people who like myself have been involved with like environmental activism over the decades, they would have been clued in, they would have educated themselves and educated other people and tried to align their strategy with like Indigenous solidarity and working to be anti-racist and anti-hierarchical and tackle like neoliberalism or capitalism or colonialization and all that sort of stuff. So my question is like, why doesn't that carry on? Why is that always on the margins and never is like, why is that always like co-opted and why are concessions always made amongst white upper middle class, the global sort of like elite folk that we're, you know, that I'm a part of? But like, yeah, why do we make concessions? And then how can we, if we're going to strategize, like Anissa said, to like try keep this going, how can we plan to try mitigate that we just don't then start like selling out again? And you know, 20 years from now, children are still just being learned to recycle. So yeah, that's kind of my question. If that comes across, it's like why are concessions made, and why is it that we're still saying yes to renewables? Like I feel like that knowledge and that education has been around for a while, but it just doesn't stay in the mainstream, or it doesn't even stay in isn't the dominant narrative even amongst the activists, amongst the white middle class folk of the world. That's my ramble.
Well, I do have an answer to that, but it's probably very reductive and not reflective of the entire truth. But simply put, it's not a pressing priority in Australia to talk about scale or talk about decentralized energy sources. If it were, it might have been. It's not, it is a pressing reality in India, but it's still not in the mainstream. That's because of power. That's because of the agenda of mainstream media, because of the governments we have and so on and so forth. So there are many different dimensions to why just and much needed narratives don't make it to the center, but they're also context specific. And thanks for the link on Original Power. I'm aware that they are talking about decent and they have a principle of what energy needs to be. What I meant with my comment is that Indigenous communities in Australia not kind of, it's not a pressing priority to have decentralized small-scale energy sources, even for Indigenous communities in Australia. It's not something they are calling out massively as a grave injustice. So I was basically coming to what is something of critical importance and an established notion of injustice versus what is not. And in Australia, given the governments we've had and given the rush for coal, I think everyone's pretty much just come to the one piece of thing that they have to do, which is stop coal. And everything else literally has been kind of just swept away by the side, and other voices just don't have a chance. That's where we are. That's the political reality. In that political reality space, groups talking about decentralized energy, groups trying to talk about other things are just not getting the space or oxygen. But that's very reductive. I think there are many more insightful understandings from within the movement about why is that happening time and again. But I reckon this is I'm happy to park this maybe for after 3:30. And people want to stay on and have a yarn about it, I'd be more than happy. Just want to hear if people have any reflections on how to take this away for this discussion today, away for some of their work. And if Anissa, you want to chuck in something, just a quick something to trigger on kind of thoughts of other people, I'd be more than happy.
Sure, yeah, a few quick thoughts on taking this stuff forward for me is like, we bring this is the, I'm a huge part of the narrative of Blockade IMARC. So we're creating that platform to kind of tell these stories. So yeah, I'm finding that a really exciting space because we don't have to have a simple narrative where we're bringing in this nuanced narrative and having those conversations. And it is also interesting, for the as Ruchira mentioned earlier, there's the Frontline Action on Coal, Blockade, Camp Bimby up in central Queensland. And one thing that kind of some of us, have talked about is, building that narrative into the actions that we do, and linking the struggles. As Ruchira talked about, there was an action a little while ago that did that. But kind of like what I'm getting from this is the kind of need to keep complicating the narrative. When someone brings a simple narrative, people like us have to just keep saying, no, it's not that simple. And a lot of people around us in Australia are going to try and simplify it, because as Ruchira said, it's not pressing. I have a very comfortable life under capitalism, therefore, and neoliberalism is therefore dismantling it doesn't feel as urgent as climate change does. But if we're going to work in true solidarity with people on the front lines around the world, then we need to be brave and have those uncomfortable conversations and kind of just keep at it. Is my thoughts. Does anyone else want to chime in or disagree? They practice disagreeing as well.
I just want to add something in terms of next steps. I think in what's happened both in the climate movement and in Stop Adani movement is trying to speak the language of the corporations that we're campaigning against and appealing to their needs rather than our own or our own visions. We're trying to steer them towards a vision that's palatable to them. And I think, this has been really insightful and has, sparked, kind of made me aware of that now. And I think sort of need to go back to the narratives that we're putting out and consider, not just trying to present something that's palatable to them, but like, what are we actually fighting for, and not trying to water that down, as we've talked about. Just having a really good think about how we put that to them in a way that's authentic and that's authentic, because I think that can be really effective sometimes as well, just speaking from the heart and speaking really truthfully and not trying to play their game. I need to flesh that out a bit more, but that's just an initial thought, is reshaping that narrative.
I think I'll just wager a quick kind of addition and response to what you said, Claudia. I think in a way, this is very true. The thing is that, there are fantastic people with deep social environmental justice values at the, kind of the bottom of their heart in the environment climate movement in Australia. But what is the problem I find is faith in a capitalist solving of the problem. And of course, Anisa, we keep talking, and Anisa talks a lot about, and it's about dismantling capitalism, and everyone a lot of people in the environment movement turn a deaf ear to it. The talking about India versus Australia, North versus South, and not about what the Indian government's talking about, but what the grassroots groups need. Looking at the difference, the thing is that in the Australian narrative, we can accept climate change and we can accept the need to phase out coal as the thing we have to do. The narrative that is missing is the part about what does that plate of food, that plate of solutions for climate change need to look like. And we're just talking about coal versus renewables. We're just talking about renewables without regard to scale, without regard to centering Indigenous life worlds, without regard to a lot of things. That part needs to change. And as you said, Claudia, the thing is that the anti-coal movement in Australia, the climate movement in Australia now is playing very strongly to good corporations versus bad corporations. The good corporations are the ones who are doing renewables. The good corporations are the investment companies which are putting money in renewables. So the frame is very much in corporate solutions. Market forces, I know people in market forces, they're fantastic people, but imagine like market forces are the things that are driving dispossession on the ground in India. So an NGO with the name of market forces would be contradictory, antithetical to the very values of environmentalism at the grassroots level in India. But market forces is what is driving the Stop Adani movement and, you know, moving groups towards divestment and stuff like that. So herein lies that fundamental difference between, you know, kind of this thing of the only strategy we now have of shifting from coal is to get investors out of coal. So we're talking a very corporate frame versus a frame that puts those things we discussed today at the center. And the Stop Adani movement and anti-coal networks, which are focused on divestment, coming to that bigger story with their part of the campaign. I think that's where the divergences are at the moment. If that makes sense, or if you agree.
Could I just quickly jump in as well and just talk a little bit about that as well? Just a few of the things that I just want to say I'm completely on training wheels, okay, when I'm talking about what I'm talking about right now. But what I'm finding as well is that with some of the things that a few of us are doing, which is not necessarily in this space here, but it's more about worker rights, is actually you know, obviously listening to affected workers and then hearing their solutions and then working towards a solution, but also identifying levers of power of how we can actually affect those solutions. So like, you know, like at the moment, we're doing something in relation to the Horticulture Award, which affects a lot of members of multicultural communities. And we learned that actually, how does that award get changed? And then we've actually gone in, made submissions. We've cross-examined people from across the other side. And what we're trying to push for is change in that way as well. So I think, I mean, I'm very anti-capitalist, but I also think that we have to recognize that we are still working within this hegemony. And if we are not at those decision-making tables, thinking about where those levers of power are strategically and actually tapping into that and outmaneuvering the people who have the power already, we cannot move towards this anti-capitalist system that we are all wanting to move towards. So that's something I just wanted to share with all of you.
If people who haven't had a chance to or haven't spoken so far want to reflect on something, that'd be great too. We are officially out of time, but happy to stay on and continue this thing of what we take away a bit longer. I'll definitely be here for a bit longer. But if people who haven't spoken, if they have any thoughts, would love to hear. And yeah, if anyone has to leave, completely understand. And thank you for coming.
Maybe just quickly to wrap up, we just wanted to advertise that there's 2 more workshops coming up. I'll put them in the chat again. So yeah, put on by the wonderful Absara, Multicultural Greens, Victoria. So yeah, one in 2 weeks and another in 4 weeks about, oops, maybe I've put the wrong ones in, about, yeah, building a culturally inclusive climate movement and cultural responsiveness and cultural intelligences. So hopefully see you all again in that. Don't know whether they'll be online or in person, but we'll keep you all updated. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. And yes, if there's anyone who hasn't spoken, please. Oh, David.
Me? Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what to say, but I'm pleased to listen to you guys. All right. So I just sort of tuned in on a flimsy iPhone and cutting in and cutting out. But I listened for that hour and I'm going to say goodbye. Thanks for talking. Did you get
Thanks,
that?
David. Yeah, we got that. Have a good one.
Hello? Hello?
Yep.
Yep. Did you hear me?
Yeah,
No.
yeah. We heard you.
It's raining in Melbourne now.
Yeah. Thanks for coming along.
And thanks for being here to listen to you. All right.
Okay.
Great stuff. See you later.
See ya.
Bye. Where do I go? Where do I go? Lee.
Dan? Oh, sorry, Richard, did you want to say something?
No, I was actually going to ask Dan, because I remember the first question they had about climate change and India versus Australia, and I wonder if I covered it in my session as well, just as a, yeah. So yeah, they kind of, I think Dan's raised his hand as well, so good.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually Nick's question, Richard, but I think you did cover it. But my small reflection was just on that earlier point around the kind of tokenism around First Nation solidarity and the climate movement, and talking about, oh, how can we make it, you know, what we're doing more accessible to First Nations people or people of color, versus just putting our weight behind First Nations led projects. And it just feels like a slightly unfortunate all or nothing situation, because yeah, I'm in a situation where I don't have much more capacity to be giving. I'm still kind of invested in the work I'm doing, which is with XR, but yeah, just wanted to share that reflection.
That can, if I can jump in, I hope it's okay. That kind of makes me also sort of question whether we should, when there's an Indigenous struggle happening, whether we should join as individuals, which I think we have been doing so far, also within XR, or if it's okay for XR to join as a movement. So for instance, I don't know, the sacred trees that were cut down in Japurung country, whether it would be seen as jumping on something that we haven't participated enough in, whether it would be seen as tokenism, or if it's okay to sort of to join with XR branding and to say, yes, as XR we are supporting. Yeah, I find this whole thing a bit difficult to sort of navigate.
My two, I just want to quickly, then I don't have a response to either of your questions, Dan and Caroline, but I just, if I were to put one word that differentiates environmental campaigns from the movements of people kind of which have historic and present dimensions, be they the ones I talked about in India or Indigenous movements, is one is continuous and a kind of intergeneration goes on, and you just have different stories of injustice that kind of, and all of the, so the thing is, my understanding is it's relational, in the sense that if you have been engaged for long enough with an Indigenous community, and there's kind of life struggles and life worlds, then I think it'll be a decision which will be clearer to you, or for you to make, rather than something when you're just trying to engage. And the only example that comes to my mind from Australia, which again, correct me if I'm wrong, people like David who've been around for long enough, is the relationships that were forged over 3 decades that then finally culminated in the fight over James Bryce gas hub. And those relationships between environmentalists, scholars, and the Gularabalu people in outside Broome, in the Kimberley, were formed for 3 decades. And the whale watching program that came both out of a combination of Indigenous knowledge and kind of Western science in that way, and many other, and walking country and everything, which was part of the resistance movement, came out of those kinds of long-term and long-held relationships. And of course, there were many tensions, but it has been written about. Stephen Mewkey, anthropologist who had walked with Uncle Paddy Rowe and written with him, and so on and so forth, talks about it as the most successful environmental movement in Australia in terms of its relationship with Indigenous people. And the only factor that makes that pivotal difference is because of the long-held relationships. And then certain things become clearer than if you're immediately trying to forge a relationship, and then come with it the pressing demand of trying to say, stop climate change or stop coal or something. So it's not rocket science. At the same time, I think time makes a difference. Please respond. Yeah.
I think that's such a good response, especially in terms of speaking directly to the Extinction Rebellion example. Like Extinction Rebellion, it's such a new group that's jumped on. The whole heap of people with really good intentions who are freaking out about climate change are jumping on this urgency bandwagon, and then they're kind of like, we need to do all this stuff. And I think I know that the time wasn't taken at the start in Australia to sit down and really map out what does Extinction Rebellion look like in Australia, because we are very different to the UK, and we need to be very different from the UK because we are a colony of the UK. And kind of, taking the slow, the building of the relationships and that sort of thing. It's kind of slowly happening now, but it didn't happen at the start. And I think in terms of a group like Extinction Rebellion getting on board in a branded way, even if, there are individuals inside XR who think we're not doing, I want to do this properly, I want to build relationships, because XR as a whole in Australia and Victoria has not taken, this sort of climate justice is not a central tenet of XR's strategy, of the public strategy, of the actions that are happening. There are individuals within who it is, but I think XR needs to admit to itself that it didn't take this seriously from the get-go, has made a lot of mistakes, and so really needs to slow down. And if people want to use the XR brand to support Indigenous struggles, then first, most people within XR need to understand what tokenism is and how to not do it, because otherwise the XR brand will jump on board and a whole lot of people in Melbourne will be like, look at us, pat on the back, we helped them. And it will be tokenistic. So to me, that just points to the important long work internally in an organization to kind of decolonize and understand these issues, which some groups have done in Australia better than others. But yeah, I saw Joe and Joel had a hand.
Hey, I suppose the thing that concerns me is I kind of see that the world is kind of going in this direction, hopefully moving away from fossil fuels, and I firmly believe that that's something that really needs to happen for the survival of a lot of ecosystems and the survival of a lot of communities. But I guess how do we make sure that enough voices are heard to be able to make those decisions, without hurting lots of communities in the process? And how do we not just create a massive influx of more problems from trying to create a solution? I suppose I don't really know how to do that. And also how to represent that now, when for someone like me, one of my major priorities is trying to even just get scientists to be taken seriously with the factual evidence that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are just really, really going to mess up the weather systems of this planet. And how to be really inclusive of everything that has been said today. It feels so big. I think that's all.
One thing that comes up constantly is it happens at the end of these kinds of sessions. It also happened at the end of the XR workshop. Some of Apsara's colleagues and myself, we did a couple of weekends back. Part of it is what Anissa said about the urgency and realizing that kind of environmental movement, different networks are coming on with an urgency, building critical relationships of trust with the people who are communities that are most marginalized by it, such as Indigenous people, is a long-term relational thing. kind of it almost becomes then an either or thing, and it get caught up in the kind of tension that you're talking about, Joe and Joel. And so it's either or. It can either be that we are with Indigenous people in this and do what we need to do to follow that trajectory, that long-term approach, building trust and listening, doing things their way, or it is that we can do the urgent things to stop climate change. And I'm someone who's been shuttling between these spaces for a very long time. And I know that others have been doing it longer. And perhaps that is the work we do. Perhaps we constantly shuttle between these two to try and understand how both happen, or if both don't happen, in a moment, what do we prioritize as an action or a decision or what we say? And maybe a pathway can be found. We don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I find myself shuttling between these two contradictions constantly, and maybe they're not contradictions. Maybe by doing that kind of shuttling, juggling, intercrossing work constantly, we'll find things that break through that dichotomy. And it all sounds philosophical and stuff, but I've just been in this space for 15 years at least, and it's just this constant shuttling, both between the North and South kind of stuff, and the community Indigenous versus kind of mainstream environmental stuff. So I don't know if that answers anything, but it's about maybe what we hold in our heads and try to work with, rather than saying it's going to be either this or that and panicking. Anybody else or anything? I know that some people haven't spoken. You don't have to, but I'd love to kind of, I know people have to go as well for the IMARC meeting at 4. So maybe another 5 minutes if anyone has anything, and so please.
Yeah. So I have an invitation. Is that okay? I send an invitation through the chat. So I'm organizing a solidarity action in support of my people, and I know it's late. It's at midnight tonight, but that's when it's 10 a.m. in South America. So it's a good time for people. It's going to be mainly to join by them with some speakers, but the solidarity action is going to be just for non-Spanish speakers to hold, a banner, in support of the Mapuche Indigenous people. But as I said, just if you have the time when you are not in bed, but that time. So thank you.
Ruchira, could I ask you some questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's fascinating that your father worked with coal in Calcutta or near Calcutta, and I was fascinated by that story, that you've moved on from there to the whole process. So I asked some questions earlier on. I just wondered, just a bit of personal information. So where does he stand now with coal, as he was an engineer involved with that in the beginning? And how did your community change? I had a feeling that you were going to tell us how it changed from when you lived there to what it's like now. But maybe that's all too detailed. Maybe that's for another discussion. But I loved the personal bits that you started giving us about your life in India, and then to see you evolve and move on, to see all the problems that have emerged as a consequence of coal mining. I was in India in the coal mines and watched how the Adivasi were being shoved away and were living in amongst all the smoke there in central India. I'm just interested in your views on how well, from your own personal perspective, how you said your community changed a lot from when you were there.
Well, not so much, thanks. Not so much my community. I only brought in my story to create those critical differentiations between, a middle class person who's had all the benefits and privileges that independent, sovereign southern nation provided in the wake of its development versus Adivasis and peasants who were displaced and dispossessed for that mode of development, I think. So yeah, so look, the thing is, the reality of India is India built itself on coal, much like almost every other nation on earth has. And Indians have a mixed relationship with coal. Where my dad stands, well, my dad, doesn't disbelieve in climate change. And he's very kind of, he loved the time that he spent in the steel plant, and when the workers used to go on strike, which used to happen very frequently because I was in a communist state, communist governments, the strikes were frequent in factories. He would be putting coal into the blast furnace. And he loved those times, and he loved the purity of the coking coal from Australia. So the thing is that, coal built India, and I think it came up in a previous workshop about there is a very different sensibility. I might be middle class like yourselves, middle class environmental activist. But the point is I do come from, I have a history of being colonized. And, the legacy of India's freedom struggle, India's independence, India's constitution, those things mean a lot to me. The nation built itself on coal. I can't dismiss the value coal had in our lives and in development. Neither can I dismiss the story of how it disenfranchised rural landed populations. So it's a very contradictory story. Now we are at a stage where coal's not exactly phasing out, there's less and less of coal mines being dug. But then renewables is coming and doing similar things to indigenous communities. So I don't have that neat demonization attitude towards coal that Australians have had through their climate campaign, because the story of dispossession, the central story of human injustice at the center of Indian environmental stories is not changing because of renewables coming in. So I have a more complicated relationship because our relationship with coal is in relation to climate change. And with climate change and clean solutions coming in, if the story in India is not changing, my relationship with coal is not as simple as what Australians have. So that's pretty much what I can say in a nutshell. I believe in all those things that all of you believe in, but my relationship is complicated simply because large-scale renewables is causing nearly as many environmental human rights issues on the ground in India as coal was. It's starting to. So that makes it complicated.
So Ruchira, then the solution clearly is not that renewable energy is a problem, but the problem is the large scale. Whereas small scale renewable energy would be very appropriate for India, particularly in rural areas, wouldn't it?
It's environmental justice and energy justice together. Yeah. Environmental energy justice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So small scale renewable energy, like a small solar farm for each village, like they have in some parts of Japan, would be very suitable for India.
It would be, and there is, I mean, those kinds of solutions have been there for a long time. It's just that when large scale renewables became such a big thing in the world and also started getting cheap, I think less and less money became available for those things. That it's global capital and what drives, global capital drives all the transformation. And global capital is driving the transformation from coal to renewables. Yeah. So with that kind of a drive, the money that might have been available for smaller scale projects started drying off. So it's a much more, which is what, as Anisa was saying, that don't simplify a story that's complicated. That is what it is with the ground in the southern context in India. And trying to simplify it and make it black and white is half the problem. And yeah. Sorry, I repeat myself. Sorry.
Do you think that like large-scale renewables are a problem like everywhere, or do you think that's quite unique to these places in India, or do you think that maybe smaller-scale renewable solutions are more viable, like globally?
Well, the thing is, they are, like India would still do large-scale projects simply because cities and large kind of factories and industries would be driven off that. And, that's the economic and social reality in the West. So you can't do away without them, but at a principle level, decentralized energy sources, which also give more autonomy to communities. I mean, we're discovering that with projects in Australia anyway already. At a principle level, that needs to be at the center of focus. I sent a link earlier to a kind of people's climate justice demands, which actually incorporate those things at the center of a global transition. I'll post that again right away. And yeah, it's basically that you can't do away with the reality of big scale projects, but decentralized as a principle and what all comes with it need to be central to conversations about climate justice. So I think, yeah, I think maybe it's a wrap now. I hope I haven't left people feeling despondent and dejected. I think, okay, let's just look at the people's demand for climate justice as something to take away. It's not, I think it clarifies things a lot, and I hope people go away. I can see some glum faces, and I'm really sorry. When I was doing my field work in Queensland for my PhD, I was told I should give people hope rather than making them despair, because they wanted to know if communities in India were better off with coal. And I told them stories from India and they felt despondent. So can we have a quick look at this, guys, before we go? Because I think this answers a lot of our questions of what I was talking about. And centering these kind of, as opposed to just a coal versus renewables frame, gives the essential focus on justice and transformation. It's points 4, 5, and 6 and 7 that kind of capture those things that I was kind of, hovering around but not able to neatly, nail.
Do you mean 4, 5, and 6 under the advanced real solutions that are just?
Yeah, it's like 4, 5, 6, and 7, kind of those, because we can, of course we can, it's not about can, of course we will talk about the fact that we need to transition from climate change as soon as possible and stop fossil fuels, of course we will. But we can hold certain things central in that transformation. What would the transformation look like? Which is 4, 5, 6, and 7 about, market-driven solutions. And we can't rely on market-driven solutions because of what they do to communities on the ground, particularly in the global south. And just kind of, yeah. So decentralization, locally available energy sources which are climate friendly, conversion of, stopping the conversion of agricultural land for kind of mass renewables and biofuel projects. And like the forests in central India are being used now for monocultures for carbon sequestration, and that's causing food insecurity, hunger amongst Adivasi people. And so when they think of climate change, they think of it as a pain in the ass because it's taking their land away from them. And they're like, we'll die of hunger today and you'll, save yourself from climate change tomorrow. That's what they say. So it's hence the conundrum. Thank you everyone very much for coming, and great conversation, at least for me. And I hope it doesn't leave you despondent, but leaves you with some insights with which you can work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anisa and Apsara, the hosts.